Westminster. We're so excited to have you here tonight. My name is Maggie Regier. I'm the student body president here at Westminster. Tonight we're here to talk about one of, if not the most important issues of our time, climate change. This is something that has overtaken news cycles just recently, but scientists, indigenous communities, and active citizens have been speaking out for much longer. My friends and I are feeling a loss of hope. I told my parents I don't want children because I do not want to raise them in an apocalypse. A lack of taking this issue seriously in past generations have left my generation to either clean up their mess or get out. Yet there isn't a simple fix. We cannot just stop using plastic straws, eat less meat, or take shorter showers and expect the planet to go back to normal. We must take a holistic and inclusive approach in order to protect all citizens of our planet and address the many facets of the effects of climate change. Our prestigious panel here tonight is here to have that conversation and remind us of the bigger picture. We are all in for an excellent evening. First up, we have student and climate justice organizer Eliza Van Dyke on the Young People's Movement for Climate Justice. Eliza is a student at Westminster studying environmental justice and an organizer for Uplift and Wasatch Rising Tide, which are climate justice collectives here in the area. Without further ado, Eliza.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. It's packed, which is awesome. So my name is Eliza. Maggie just introduced me. Thank you so much, Maggie. And before I start, I want to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Ute, Goshute, and Shoshone peoples here at Westminster College. And I'm going to be talking about climate justice, so this is a really important thing to keep in mind throughout this entire panel and throughout our entire lives here at Westminster. And I'm speaking as myself, but I'm also speaking as a member of a team of young people who organize throughout the region. And so what I bring to this presentation comes from our collective work. So what is climate justice? Climate justice acknowledges that climate change is a social justice issue. It acknowledges that both the causes and the effects of climate change disproportionately impact communities that have been systemically marginalized and oppressed. So this is indigenous nations across our region, communities of color in both rural and urban settings, and lower income communities. And so when we're talking about climate justice, we are really trying to address the root causes of the climate crisis. So we're looking at exploitative institutions, systems such as the legacies of colonialism. We're looking at our economic system and extractive capitalist practices, and we're looking at power structures that perpetuate injustice. Because what we're really acknowledging is that injustice is as much of a threat to life and flourishing on this planet as climate change, and the two are really inseparable. So the other thing that we do is we're centering communities who are most impacted by climate change, and so these are people often use the term frontline communities, and we are prioritizing grassroots solutions to the climate crisis, so solutions that are coming directly from these impacted communities. And lastly, we are really interested in justice for all beings. So there's no hierarchy of human to non-human living beings. When we're thinking about climate change, we're thinking about collective liberation of all living things. I'm not going to go too deep into climate injustice because I really want to focus on the young people's movement, but it is helpful to think of a few key issues in the climate injustice that we are currently experiencing. And in our region specifically, there are entire swaths of land that are designated to extraction, known as energy sacrifice zones. Often these swaths of land are on indigenous nations and disproportionately impact low-income communities and communities of color, so we're keeping in mind the justice aspect of climate justice. Just some statistics on that. In 2015, 30% of America's coal west of the Mississippi and up to 50% of uranium lay within Native American tribal lands. When we're talking about extractive industries and we're talking about climate justice, we really have to keep these things in mind. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that immigrant justice and migrant justice are climate justice issues. And so if we're advocating for just energy futures and a just climate future, we're also advocating for immigrant justice. We're also advocating for Indigenous sovereignty. We're also advocating for all of these other interwoven issues. And so something that really helps put this into perspective is that Hurricane Maria led to almost 5,000 deaths and left hundreds of thousands more in Puerto Rico without power or access to necessary health services, forcing over 179,000 people to leave the island for the mainland US. So this is just a small picture of one occurrence that led to huge migration, so something to keep in mind. In our area, there are so many examples of climate injustice. A few, the Inland Port Project, which will bring increased train, road, and air traffic to the northwest quadrant of Salt Lake City, is going to potentially impact predominantly communities of color. So this is a project of environmental racism. And then when we're thinking about also justice for all living things and living beings, this project threatens the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. And then in our greater region, in Utah, the White Mesa Uranium Mill is the only operating conventional uranium mill in the United States. And it's only 3 miles from the Ute Mountain Ute tribal nation. So that's another example in our region of climate injustice. So now to the young people's movements for climate justice. And when I say movements, I mean that there are so many different movements happening in this region, happening in this nation, and in this world. I'm speaking specifically about a movement that I am engaged in. And these are some of the things that we believe and practice. So we believe in collective liberation. I said that earlier, and what that means to me is that no one is free until we're all free. And so that means when we're thinking about climate justice and we're thinking about justice for the future, we're thinking about every living being on this earth. We're thinking about every person in every community. And so we really have to prioritize justice in our movements. Secondly, we demand a just transition. So what this means is when we're transitioning to sustainable or regenerative energy futures, we have to do so in a way that also prioritizes justice. So who's working in extractive industries? Who are the coal miners? Where are their jobs going to come from? In our communities in rural Utah, we have to be thinking about really making sure that all of our communities have access to flourishing economies and that we're not just replacing coal with solar and leaving people jobless. And so it's thinking about really systemic transition and huge change in the world that we live in. We demand an end to all forms of extraction. This includes uranium, which many think is a potential alternative to highly polluting fossil fuels, but it's incredibly extractive and it leaves a lot of communities with contaminated water sources, frankly, radioactive homelands. And so that when we say all extraction, we mean all extraction. We follow the leadership of Indigenous peoples and people of color and those most impacted by the climate crisis. This is really important because our movements are prefigurative. And what that means is we are trying to currently live and work in the vision that we want for our future. So if we imagine a world where all of our communities have access to just economies and everyone has access to beauty and flourishing, then that's what we have to be practicing right now with each other, in our communities, in our schools, as much as we possibly can. We believe in a diversity of tactics for change. So we practice nonviolent direct action. We practice engaging in our electoral system. We practice storytelling and healing and art. And The reason that we do this is because we are in a huge moment of transition. And so we have to really strategically work within and beyond our current system. We acknowledge that the current systems that we're living within are extremely oppressive and do not support the living of all beings. And we are living in these systems, so we have to find ways to be revolutionary both within and beyond our spaces and places that we live in. So I work with a group called Uplift, and that is who I do the majority of my organizing with, and so that's who I'm representing today. And as of a couple months ago, we are a fully autonomous, youth-led climate justice group on the Colorado Plateau and in the greater Southwest, which is really exciting. And we connect, train, and mobilize young people for climate justice. So we have organizers across Utah, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and on indigenous nations on the Colorado Plateau. That's who I'm representing. So I'm addressing a room of mostly young people, which is really awesome. I wasn't sure who the crowd was going to be today. I would like to invite you all to join us. I have contact information on a later slide, but we're launching a series of collectives across the region for training and action. So if this is something that sounds interesting to you, let me know. And we also have a series of fellowship opportunities throughout the coming year and would love to get any of you involved if you're interested in that. And if you're not a young person in this room, you can still support us by donating to us, by listening to your students, by supporting young people across the world, across the region, by opposing the Inland Port Project. And I put out some zines on the table as you walk in, and there is a list of other organizations that work on climate and environmental justice that you can also support. Here's my contact information, and Uplift, here's our information as well. So if you would like to contact me or follow us, or you work with the group and you'd like to be partnered, let me know. And I also wanted to end on a moment of hope. We are living in really challenging times and really transitional times. And as young people, as Maggie said, we don't know what our future looks like in this moment. The reason I chose to theme this presentation around sunflowers is because sunflowers are the national symbol for the climate justice movement. They absorb toxins in their tissues, healing the land, and they symbolize resilience and justice. They're the beauty and the hope that continue to shine in chaos. Thank you.
Up, we have Bonnie Baxter Clark, a professor of biology and the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute, with a presentation on climate change and our watershed. Dr. Baxter has spent two decades studying the Great Salt Lake, in particular microbiology. She is co-editing the first book on the lake's biology, which will be published in the spring, and authored a chapter in the book on the Great Salt Lake and climate change. She currently serves on statewide committees which address the fate of the lake and our watershed. Here's Bonnie.
Great to see you all here today. So I do work on Great Salt Lake, and Great Salt Lake is at the bottom of the watershed. So this is an outline of the Pleistocene, the Ice Age Lake Bonneville. And when it dried up after a giant climatic change event, as we went from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, Great Salt Lake was the puddle at the bottom of the bathtub that was remaining. And this is now the current watershed in orange. and you can see the river systems that come into Great Salt Lake. So I'm going to mostly talk about the lake as kind of the canary in the coal mine, because the inputs that change with respect to water, and that is a reflection of climate, are seen directly in this terminal lake. So it is normal for a terminal lake to shrink and swell over time. That has always happened because it is at the bottom of the largest watershed in North America. And so it responds to water input from precipitation, and it responds to evaporation, which is related to temperature. The problem is, this is the 1980s, this was 2010, now we have shrunk further than that. So the problem is we're on a decline that is increasing and not letting up. So it's not its normal cycle anymore. The other thing about Great Salt Lake is that its surface area is exposed for evaporation in ways that other terminal lakes in the West aren't. You see how it's super shallow and flat relative to other lakes, so it can evaporate really readily, and the decline of the lake is in part related to its structure, so it's telling us something. So my students and I study the microbes that are in the lake that turn over the nutrients and feed the invertebrates in the lake and also in the wetlands, and those feed 5 million birds. This is the most important body of water on the Pacific Flyway. So if something happens to this lake, this ecosystem will crush millions of birds, and that's 247 species. The shorelines are declining, and what does that mean for us? Why is that happening? One of the reasons is an increase in the population in the watershed. This represents 83% of the population of Utah, this watershed. So the bigger this population gets, the more consumptive use, the more use for agriculture. So that's definitely one of the reasons for the decline. Also, we have a really bad water ethic in Utah. We have cheap water, which makes people spend no energy thinking about the water that they use. So you'll notice in Arizona, there aren't lawns, but in Salt Lake City, there's a ton of grass lawns, right? Because we water our lawns. So it's a different water ethic here than maybe it should be. But the main reason that we're seeing the decline is related to climatic factors. So this is surfacing as the primary driver of the problems that we're seeing. And this part is only going to get worse. We can do something about this part, and this is likely to get worse. So we really have to pay attention. The Southwest of the United States has some pretty dire predictions based on some really good science about climate change. If the water is declining, what happens to the ecosystem? If the lake gets concentrated, the salts get concentrated, the system gets even more salty. Those invertebrates and those microorganisms die. The birds no longer have anything to eat. The ecosystem collapses. So in terms of just the system, yeah, we ought to care about that. But some people are going to be like, I don't care about birds. Well, okay, so what about humans? The impact of the lower lake level on humans will impact both economic services and ecosystem services. If you want to know how much the lake gives the state of Utah, it's $1.32 billion annually and more than 7,000 jobs. So the lake goes away, the state loses money, we lose jobs. That's one thing to care about. Ecosystem services, there was a report done in 2012 by the State Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, and they looked at two main factors and estimated that the ecosystem services from this lake is probably between 46 million and 95 million, but they based that on two main things. One is that we all poop into the lake. Seriously. So our sewage goes into the lake. It's part of our watershed. And our sewage gets cleaned before it goes into the lake. But if our lake had fish in it, it would have to be cleaned extra. And we save money by not having to treat water the way you do when you poop into a basin that is fresh water. So being a little crude here, but that's true. So we save money on sewage treatment. We have to treat our sewage less than other places. The other point that they looked at were recreation on the lake, but things that they didn't look at that also are important. It's hard to calculate like what you get from the environment just from a cultural, spiritual standpoint. And also, they didn't calculate things like the ski industry. We depend on this lake effect, snow, right, for industry in Utah, and also a whole lot of fun. That lake effect snow is another ecosystem service. Dust mitigation is a really big one, and I'm going to get into that in a second. It is critical for so many reasons that we keep this lake full of water to prevent dust from blowing into the valley. What will happen if Great Salt Lake shrinks even more? We're currently sitting at a historic low. That means in the time that we've been measuring the lake elevation, it hasn't been lower than it is right now. We're just several inches above the historic low of 1963, so we're right at that historic low. Real concern that a lot of us have is about dust, because what happened in California is that LA sucked the water out of Owens Lake, and it became a dry valley, and produced dust storms like no one had ever seen before, set air quality records. So now 20% of everyone's water bill in Los Angeles goes to pay for sprinkling and mitigating the dust of Owens Lake. We don't want our valley to look like that. The other thing down here I have is about albedo, and that has to do with dust blowing onto snow. Snow is usually reflective, but if dust blows onto snow, now it absorbs heat and warmth from the sun, and it melts. And this changing of the mistiming of the snow melt is a problem, because our snowpack slowly recharges groundwater in our watershed. If the melt of the snow, the timing changes, you can run off too quickly, you can evaporate too quickly, and not recharge groundwater. So that could be devastating to our whole watershed and our water supply. I want to end here with a presentation that was given to the state of Utah this week by a consulting group. Jeff Demblaker from Jacobs, this consulting group, is hired by the state to do some modeling about predictions on Great Salt Lake and the elevation. And this might not make a little sense. I'll just take you through. He talked about 4 different scenarios, and he's looking at 10 years from now, so 2030, started modeling for 2020 to 2030. If you look at the change in elevation, if we do nothing right now, if our water usage is the same, we expect the lake to go down 3.3 feet, which is a huge amount of water loss. That's a huge amount of shoreline exposure. If we adopt the state water strategy that's being considered, the lake will go down still almost 2 feet. If we do some innovative, adaptive innovation, their model calls it, if we get really innovative with it, it's possible we could reduce that to a reduction of water of 1.2 feet. If we do nothing and we get the hot population growth that we're anticipating, that the state is always bragging about, because we're growing and we're developing, and if that happens and we do nothing, the lake could go down almost 12 feet, and that would be completely catastrophic. That's a 10-year window we're talking about, so I had to share that with you. It's new data, but I thought it was super interesting. So I'll leave this with the idea that we really need to get active. This lake is telling us something about our watershed. It is the canary in the coal mine. It's speaking to us. There are terminal lakes all over the world that are drying up, like Lake Urmia in Iran, the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan, because these terminal lakes are at the bottom of basins that we are using the water before it gets there. I think we should listen to the message that it's sending.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bonnie. Next up, we have Public Health Professor Han Kim on climate change and health. Han Kim has been a professor at Westminster for 12 years. After getting his undergraduate degree at the University of Michigan in engineering, he pursued a doctoral degree in epidemiology from the University of Washington. He teaches in the undergraduate and graduate public health programs, as well as in the Honors College. His public health interests include the social determinants of health, the impacts of social justice on health systems, and convincing pre-med students to study public health instead of biology. Sorry, Bonnie. Here is Han Kim.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to take it a little bit global this time. I think Bonnie did a great job of kind of looking at the local effects of climate change. I'm going to go take it a little bit global. I'm a little bit shocked. I'm usually the one that talks about poop, and Bonnie already talked about it. So I don't know what to talk about. But anyways, I think I'll find something. Recently, The Lancet published Lancet is a big medical journal. They published an issue on climate change and health. And all the big shots of public health and atmospheric sciences got together, and their statement was that global climate change is probably the biggest public health crisis in history. And that might sound like hyperbole, but most of us think that's true. This is an existential crisis in terms of health. And what's really insidious about this is that how global climate change affects health in ways that you wouldn't even expect. It has its tentacles in just about every aspect of health. And I'm going to try to kind of cover that in the next 10 minutes. I divide up the effects of global climate change on health into two aspects, direct and indirect. So the direct effects are literally the heat itself. And you're thinking, well, what is a few degrees Celsius increase going to do about health, right? I mean, it doesn't, we deal with temperature changes all the time. Well, here's the problem. We're getting a lot more heat waves. We call them extreme heat events. There's no real definition of them, but we're getting a lot more of them. You probably notice. During these heat waves, we have significant increases in mortality. Okay? It's hard to measure this because it's not like the bodies are filling the streets. It's just deaths. It's quiet deaths. People living in an apartment by themselves without air conditioning, dying just ones and twos. And oftentimes we don't identify those deaths as heat-related deaths because they resemble other forms of death. So we don't really have a good idea of how many people die because of direct effects of health. We do know that there is an increase. It's just, unfortunately, the way epidemiology is right now, it's really hard to measure that. But it is happening. We're getting more and more of these events. You hear about heat events in Europe, in US. And I'm glad that social justice was mentioned because this is going to be a theme that I'm going to be talking about. The people that get most affected by this are people from the historically oppressed peoples. And I want to add further, these are typically people who contributed the least amount of carbon into the environment as well. So that's a serious justice issue. And that's going to be a theme that I'm going to touch on when I talk about the global impacts of climate change. So this is just, throughout time, how many hotter days we have in Houston. And in cities, this is exacerbated because cities are huge heat sinks. Okay? It can be sometimes 10, 15 degrees hotter in cities. And of course, the hottest parts of any city are going to be neighborhoods with low socioeconomic status people because of lack of trees, lots of concrete, parking lots, tends to absorb heat. It's much, much hotter. This is a worst case projection. This is a heat index of 100, the number of days that we're going to experience days with a heat index of 100. Heat index is a combination of heat and humidity. That's why Utah doesn't seem to be as highly affected because we don't have the humidity that, say, the Southeast does. And that is, the top one up there is historic from 1970 to about 1990. That is mid-century if we do nothing, if we keep the current levels of CO2 growth, and then that is the end of the century. So we're talking about some significant heat events. So the heat itself is going to affect people. And not just through, say, heat exhaustion and heat stroke, but increases in early, for example, there's studies that show that heat events are strongly associated with early labor. And so low birth weight babies. So maternal mortality and infant mortality. So it affects health in very, very insidious ways. This is in Iran. A few years ago, they hit a record, 165. That was the heat index. Combination of temperature and humidity. It's right at the edge of the Persian Gulf. Now, that 165, though, is a kind of a funny number because here's the NOAA's measure of heat index. And it's hard to read, but that number doesn't even exist. It's off the charts. And that's another theme. I'm going to talk about off the charts. And it is really, really scary. Okay? So, these places, the Middle East in particular, I don't know if you've heard, Qatar is going to be hosting the World Cup in the summer, which is a brilliant idea, right? Brilliant. So what did they do to one of the stadiums? They air conditioned it. It's an outdoor stadium, they air condition it. Now obviously most countries don't, and of course they do that by burning more oil, contributing more to global climate change. But they can do that because they're wealthy. But the rest of the world can't do that. Okay? And so they're projecting that parts of the Middle East are going to be uninhabitable in the next few decades. I mean, literally you can't live in there because it's too hot. Now that's going to contribute, I'm going to talk about how this contributes to some health issues as well. Another direct way that climate change affects health is through the spread of infectious diseases, particularly vector-borne diseases. Even slight changes in global temperature will change the range of vectors. For example, the Anopheles mosquito and malaria. We're already seeing evidence of this. We have Florida, because it's always Florida, we have dengue transmission native to Florida. Dengue was eradicated from the US. We now have dengue fever, which is transmitted by the mosquito. Chikungunya. We just identified Chagas disease, which is a disease typical of Latin America. No one's gotten it yet, but we've identified the vectors that has having Chagas disease. So this is already happening, and this is just a list of diseases and the potential for spread. So malaria, schistosomiasis, which is spread by snails, filariasis, which is spread by mosquitoes, onchocerciasis, river blindness, dengue, yellow fever. Those all have a potential to spread, possibly into areas in the developed world where these diseases were eradicated centuries ago. It's not just vector-borne diseases either. Cholera, that is Vibrio cholerae. Cholera is an interesting one. It lives in brackish waters. It's a tough bugger. It survives in brackish waters in the tropics. And there's some evidence that the range of cholera is starting to spread. Could it spread to the US? Well, it's in Mexico. So very possibly could work its way up the Gulf Coast, and we could have cholera outbreaks. Luckily, we have a very robust sanitation system for the most part, and we should be okay, but that's definitely a fear. Now, another way, so those are the direct ways. The indirect ways are even more dangerous, okay? So you might not think of some of these issues as linked to global health, but it is. For example, food yields. Food yields, they're projecting 6 to 12% decline in food yields. Now, that might not seem like a lot. You can pay a little bit more at Whole Foods, and you're fine with it. However, the 2 to 3 billion people who are this close to poverty, who barely have enough to eat, it's going to affect them dramatically. Okay, so that's a serious issue. Again, people who suffer the most, the people who contributed least to the problem, including many, many, many children. Not only food, but water. Water's a big one. This is water stress. You heard about the term day zero. That's a new one, right? Cape Town almost had day zero. That's the day they run out of water. That's a scary concept, okay? Recently, Chennai in India experienced that as well. I showed this map because this is where about 2.5 to 3 billion people live. All get water from the Himalayas. Glaciers that are shrinking. What happens when those glaciers shrink? It's food for thought. This is a overhead. This group has been doing projects looking at different reservoirs in different parts of the world. This is a reservoir in Morocco, and they did satellite imagery for several years, and this is what's happening. And they've looked at several other reservoirs. They're all shrinking. And so, we're at the point where we're not going to be fighting wars over oil. We're going to be fighting wars over water. Air pollution is another indirect way that climate change is exacerbating. Bonnie mentioned it briefly. As drought occurs, we're going to have dust being kicked up. And that dust typically has heavy metals, PM10s, PM2.5s. Right now, you can see that number 5 risk factors for total number of deaths is air pollution. Estimates anywhere from 1 to 10 to 1 to 20 people in China die because of air pollution. This is something that we know about, of course, because it's inversion season. Now, this is a horrible picture because it's supposed to be a horrible picture. That's Delhi. I don't know if you've heard about New Delhi. Their AQI, we don't know what their AQI is. Now, our AQI on a really bad day is probably about 250, 300, okay? And those are the days that's just horrible, right? You taste it and you're staying inside. The maximum measuring tool in New Delhi measures the maximum of 999. It got pegged. We have no idea what the AQI is here. And it's been going on for weeks. Okay? So how is air pollution associated? Well, number one, heat actually, ground ozone pollution is generated by heat. Okay, that's one way. Another way is, again, drought exacerbated by heat increases dust. Okay? And of course, the burning of fuels that contribute to CO2 also contributes to a whole lot of other pollution. This is an interesting one, and this is one I discovered recently. Allergies. I know this doesn't seem like a big deal. You sneeze a little bit, you buy some Kleenexes, but as climate changes, we're going to have more pollen in the air, more allergies. By the way, allergies and asthma do lead to significant disease burden as well, and people do die of asthma attacks. So it's not something to disregard. Like I said, it's this insidious, the different ways that climate change affects all aspects of health. Storms, increased storms. We've all noticed. There seems to be a lot of Cat 5 hurricanes nowadays. Right? This is a few years ago. That's Maria in the center, Kasia over by Mexico, and that's Jose out to sea. That was an extraordinary picture. 3 hurricanes in the North Atlantic at the same time, all lined up. We're going to see more of this. As the temperatures of the ocean rise, that of course feeds hurricanes. The intensity of hurricanes are going to increase. And also, they're just becoming wetter. I think which was Hurricane Harvey just sat on top of Houston and just dumped water. That was unbelievable. That was wild. That was really, really disturbing. The winds weren't the issue. It just kept dumping water. Just fed water off the Gulf Coast and just dumped it on Houston. We're going to see more of those storms. We're seeing these storms stall over land and just dump water. And this is going to cause a lot of issues as well from a health standpoint. This is just to show that this is what's going on. Hurricane category strength is increasing. We seem to be getting more. We don't even hear about all the typhoons and cyclones in the Pacific. There's been several huge ones, really unusually huge ones. Sea levels are going to rise. We haven't even mentioned that yet. Sea levels will rise. And again, who are going to be most affected? People who contributed the least. This is Bangladesh. Most of Bangladesh is at or below sea level. Also, most of the fertile farmland is in that delta, which is now the salinity is increasing, and therefore it's not farmable, which affects food production. It also affects migration, which I'll talk about in a second. And of course, we have the Pacific Islands. They've contributed almost nothing to carbon. They have almost zero carbon footprint, yet they have, as countries, evacuation plans to evacuate the entire country. So, and what's sad is, a lot of these countries do need our help, but funders are very reluctant to build any sort of infrastructure on an island that may disappear in the next few decades. It's a double whammy. And again, the social justice issue is serious here. One of the other theme to this is cycles and feedback loops and how these are all interconnected. Every single factor I talked about are all interconnected, right? For example, this is a study, and in fact, this is a study done that links the Syrian conflict, which cost millions of lives, incredible suffering and pain, has been indirectly linked to climate change. Climate change has forced farmers to move into cities. Whenever you have migration and population dislocations, you have conflict. we're entering the days of climate refugees now. And just given the rhetoric now about the anti-immigration rhetoric now, imagine if the refugees increase by exponentially. What's going to happen? So this is to me the scariest part, is how climate change can cycle into human conflict. Water wars. Will countries be fighting for water? The Mekong River feeds multiple countries in Southeast Asia. What if China decides to dam it? What will Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand do? Right? Same with Africa. What if Sudan decides to dam the Nile? So this is this is probably the scariest part, and the part that people think about the least. Even the Pentagon, the bleeding hearts at the Pentagon, have determined that global climate change is a serious security issue and that they need to plan for it, that we will have conflict and war due to climate change. So, how do I end this on a good note? Because that was pretty depressing. I mean, it really was. I guess, we have cycles, and we often talk about these feedback loops, these negative feedback loops, but there can be positive feedback loops as well, all right? There can be. I really do believe that. I don't think it's too late to change these issues. We have the wherewithal, we have the technology to change the way we produce energy, to implement flaming planning, to reduce population sizes, to increase migration, to start moving people to where they want to be and where they're needed the most. I think these are possible, and they can mitigate many of the very serious problems that I mentioned. So, thank you.
Russ Costa is a cognitive scientist who studies attention and perception in the lab and decision-making in high-risk environments and outside of it. He earned his bachelor's degree from Middlebury College in Vermont and his master's and doctoral degrees at the University of Utah in psychology, specializing in cognition and neurosciences. He teaches a variety of interdisciplinary courses in the Honors College and the neuroscience program here at Westminster. Please welcome Russ.
Thank you. Thank you to Maggie for moderating this. It's great to see Eliza presenting, and thank you to John for bringing us all together. One of the reasons I was so excited to present here was sort of the opportunity for an interdisciplinary conversation between economists, environmental studies scientists, biologists, public health professors, and students together to have this conversation. I think Westminster, in our sort of small liberal arts college setting, provide a great opportunity to have these conversations, and it's a great role that we can play in this local community. I figured being kind of the middle of the lineup here on a Thursday night, there would be a good way to get your attention by putting pictures of burning vineyards and wine, wake everyone up. Also recent, this was from a couple weeks ago up in Sonoma County. As much as I've been interested in climate change my whole life, as partly from my background in the mountains, as a mountaineer, made a lot of important decisions on glaciers over the years. And one of the interesting things about having 2 decades of experience doing that now is that sort of longevity is there to see how different some of the places on Denali, on Rainier, that I've spent a lot of time, look now than they did 20 years ago when I started that career. And so I've had of course, a personal connection, but not really an academic one. And so if John had put this together a year ago, I would have declined. Because when we were talking about global warming, I said that's a problem for the climatologists. And even if we move to climate change, that's still kind of climatology. With some of the events Han was talking about, and with sort of these strengthening storms, bigger fires, et cetera, it was starting to move a little closer to my lane, but it was still not my problem necessarily. And then last January, there was several fatal accidents actually that occurred in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. And I had a lot of colleagues in those fields who fight fire and deal with snow safety. And they started calling, emailing, I've spent a lot of time, about one trip a month over the last year or so, working down there and saying that this is no longer just a problem for the climate scientists. There's a decision-making problem here. We have a lot of the accidents could be tied to expert error. And the question was, we don't know how to predict events, dangerous events, high-impact events that lead to fatalities in this new environment, in this new climate. And so I've kind of been down there a lot as a work on decision-making in teams and in these type of environments lately. And so the two questions I wanted to approach today in the next 8 minutes or so is one is sort of how is the perception and also the memory of experts different, and how do they use these skills to make decisions differently? And so we know from empirical work from the military and actually from commercial aviation, for example, that pilots see the runway differently than novices do. I've never landed an aircraft, so no one's, but I have in simulators, and that's different than we look for an expert pilot with, I don't know, 10,000 hours experience. That number comes from Malcolm Gladwell. I'm not a huge fan of that number or that theory. It's kind of problematic, but it gives us a base point. Experts see the world differently. And one of the things I've been working on is how do they perceive the world differently, and how do they use this additional information to make decisions arguably better? Certainly we want surgeons who have lots of experience operating on us. When we hire, we look for teachers who have taught in this environment, they've taught their subject matter. We want to hire experts. But the other question became really obvious last year is that experts also make errors. And how and why and when and what situations do experts make errors? That became a big question in sort of my research program. Oh, I also wanted to say here that this was not an error. I didn't want to throw UDOT under the bus or UHP. This was actually a successful avalanche mitigation that occurred last January down in Provo Canyon on State Road 191. No one was hurt here, but there were some more extreme examples. These were recorded not on, for example, Little Cottonwood Canyon Road, but these were recorded on Interstate 70, east of Denver, for those of you who know Interstate 70 around the Frisco area, near Copper Mountain Ski Area, that area where the interstate was open and you had cars being hit with large avalanches. There's a cost for closing that road, particularly a major interstate highway like Highway 70, and the Bayesian decision trees we were using to model this were quite odd in the sense that what is the monetary cost for closing the highway for hours or days versus what is the cost of opening it, that human cost. And in that model, you end up sort of having to assign a value to human life there, and sort of you can never zero that risk. And so you can't just say, well, someone could die, so we must always close the road because it's always danger. And so making models in this environment became particularly difficult because the 50-year history of the road, the 50-year history of the terrain around the road was not really predictive of what was going on. There was nothing in the sort of lived experience or known experience for even the people who've worked for, in this case, CDOT, Colorado Department of Transportation, their entire career in their history. In a sense, you had a lot of Department of Transportation workers throwing their hands up saying, we have no idea what's going to happen this winter. It's not like anything we've ever seen before. And the equivalent maybe in everyday life, those who aren't involved in sort of making highway decisions would be a doctor saying, we've never seen this before, we don't know what to do. And to see that level of uncertainty was disconcerting, right, in terms of the decision-making process. The bottom point here is important as well. It's my colleague, Dr. Kelly Elders at Colorado Mountain College, is a hydrologist out on the Front Range, and argues that essentially increased variability means greater extremes, as Han pointed out, but also greater uncertainty in predicting them, less predictive power into this model, and greater uncertainty in the world we're working in. This is actually the hardest transition I've had to talk in a while, moving from floods, fires, avalanches to chess. I've been giving similar talks the last few months, and there's no way around this other than the base of knowledge we have in this from cognitive science actually comes from studying experts in domains that might be slightly lower risk, like chess. In this classic study, it's actually from the 70s, I still teach, William Chase and Herb Simon studied sort of what makes chess experts or chess masters different at perceiving the world than, say, chess novices. And really just focus on the left side. What they would do here is sort of have a chess game ongoing and stop the game in the middle and kind of take a snapshot of that And then they would show that snapshot to chess masters, ranked amateurs, and beginners, and then later give them a memory test on this. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the chess masters scored highest, remember in 16, position of 16 pieces on the board they were shown. Chess ranked amateurs were about half as much with 8 pieces, and beginners the lowest amount with 4 pieces. But it wasn't just that chess masters had better memory. In fact, what they did later is just sort of, instead of having a random game they froze in the middle, assign the pieces randomly all over the board in not a way that would happen in a natural chess game. And you can see the advantage between the group goes away. In other words, chess masters were only experts in a domain that they've worked in before, that they've trained in, that they've learned in. One of the problems with doing this in chess is that chess is a very predictable game, as much as we use it as sort of checkers down here, chess up here, relative to sort of predicting fire, predicting avalanches. It's a much more simple environment with a black and white board and sort of rules for the pieces that nature doesn't always obey. Some of my work has been sort of extending these models of expertise derived from primary lab work into outdoor environments, into natural environments, and more complex environments. What Herb Simon would end up concluding from this work is that expertise and expert intuition is sort of nothing more or less than recognition. That experts are better able to sort of quickly sense and realize pieces of the world and tie that to patterns in their memory to make good decisions. It's where Gary Klein works from, develops the recognition prime decision model, decision-making, working a lot with firefighters. The firefighters are more quickly able to recognize situations because they have tens of thousands of hours of experience, quickly able to recognize things that a novice wouldn't be able to recognize and make decisions accordingly. So Klein writes a lot about a case of firefighters entering this is a structure fire, a home, and all the key, in fact, the person who reported suggested it was a kitchen fire. But quickly, the expert firefighters realized the fire was actually underneath the floorboards, and they evacuated in time, and no one got hurt. And they had to make that decision really, really, really quickly. Much of the work, and one of the reasons I started in decision-making work again, was actually I started teaching the Data Society and decision-making course in our honors college, and began sort of looking at decision-making work again, an old research topic of mine, to prep for it. And we used Danny Kahneman's work, who won a Nobel Prize by studying economic decision-making. We fell into what's known as the heuristics and biases paradigm, where we started looking at expert errors in the case of using intuition led to errors, and sometimes high-cost errors. Klein's work actually contrasts that, said expert performance can actually be better. We know that. And in sort of true interdisciplinary fashion, Klein and Kahneman were able to get together, and this paper is about 10 years old now, from 2009, and talk about the difference between their approaches, particularly on expert intuition. And I strongly recommend everyone read this paper. It's an American psychologist from 2009. It's a fascinating sort of summary of 20 years or so of human factors research in psychology. To spoil it and just go right to the conclusion, what they conclude is that expert intuition can be trusted if 2 conditions are met. The first, that the environment is sufficiently regular to be predictable. The second, that the expert has had sufficient time to learn the regularities of that environment. And what I'm going to conclude here today is that these situations don't apply to our new world. The snowpacks we're seeing, the fire grounds we're seeing, the fire conditions we're seeing, floodplains are not sufficiently regular anymore. The environment is too different to sort of be predictable from the experience of experts. And certainly experts have not had the time to learn those regularities. And so not only might the world get warmer, drier, I think it's also going to get more dangerous on the short term, as we don't have good enough predictive models to predict what's going to happen, particularly for these big events, not only hurricanes, but also fires, floods, avalanches, and it's going to affect us here in the West in the way we use roads, the way we open roads, close roads, and in many other ways. So Brent's going to turn this around and make it more hopeful, but that's my depressing take from cognitive science.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm a little bit ready for a more positive turn here. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Brent Olson, who is an associate professor of environmental studies here at Westminster. Before becoming a professor of environmental studies, Brent Olson worked as a canoe guide, a backpack guide, and a snowboard instructor. Now, he teaches courses focused on local impacts of global environmental issues and the political economy of natural resources, with a particular emphasis on the natural and cultural landscapes of the American West. To escape these often depressing issues, he also aims to ride his bike just as much as possible. Let's give a warm welcome to Brent.
Y'all gave such professional bios, I sort of feel like I missed the boat. Who's feeling a little depressed? Who's feeling a little scared? No, that's not true. Give me 4 minutes, and then I'm gonna turn the corner, I hope. I hope we're gonna turn the corner in 4 minutes. Here's where I wanna start. Hope demands clear eyes, honest assessment. Richard Lear begins his book, Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation, by recounting the story of Chief Plentycoo, the last great chief of the Crow Nation. He told this story to Frank Lindeman after the Crow had been confined to the reservation. And Lindeman quotes Plentycoo like this: "I can think back before the extermination of the bison and tell you much more about war and horse stealing. But when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and we could not lift them back up again. After this, nothing happened." What do we do when our hearts fall to the ground? We know that our atmosphere is unlike any humans have ever known. What does that breakdown look like in our world? And today I'm going to talk about 4 characteristics of the climate crisis. First, that it represents change. Second and third and fourth, that it's unequal, nonlinear, and unexpected. First, the climate crisis represents change. The impacts are here, now, and we see them in global wildfires, receding glaciers, heat waves, tropical storms, drought, coral bleaching, insects and disease migration, and melting permafrost. And that's only some of the impacts. The 6th extinction, there are many more. And we're seeing these impacts in the non-human world. The impacts on people are also present in migration, conflict, health impacts, infrastructure delay, growth and disaster economics, famine, flooding, and again, the list could go on. A primary characteristic of the new climate is change. And we also know that this change is unequal. Different parts of the planet are warming faster than other parts. Any global average increase in climate temperature is likely to lead to a much higher temperature increase at the poles. And cities, and remember most people now live in cities, also heat faster than the global climate average. And if sea level rise is a critical risk associated with climate crisis, it's also important to note that some coasts will see more rise than others. And so again, any inequality of change isn't limited to just natural phenomena. And it's a truism in geographies of disaster that natural disasters don't clear away existing inequalities, creating blank slates, but rather, they exacerbate those inequalities and create new ones. And further, we know that those countries and regions that are most responsible for carbon emissions are also the least vulnerable. And the countries that are least responsible are the most vulnerable. The IPCC puts it succinctly: people who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, or otherwise marginalized are especially vulnerable to climate change, and also to some adaptation and mitigation responses. This heightened vulnerability is rarely due to a single cause. Rather, it's the product of intersecting social processes that result in inequalities in socioeconomic status and income, as well as in exposure. Such social processes include, for example, discrimination on the basis of gender, class, ethnicity, age, and disability. A third characteristic of the climate crisis is that it's at least partially nonlinear. The literatures on climate change are filled with discussions of feedback loops, tipping points, and nearly telekinetic connectivity. Like water that's solid at less than 30 degrees and liquid when it's warmer than that, the climate and the biophysical conditions associated with it seem to change slowly until they don't. The baselines we have used no longer apply. One new study has shown that by 2050, coastal floods that historically we could expect to see once every 100 years will happen annually. in some cities around the world, including Los Angeles. And finally, I want to be careful how I talk about this because I don't want to imply that scientists don't know what they're talking about. They do, and we should trust them. So please trust me when I say that I'm not indicting scientists when I say this next thing. But a fourth characteristic of climate change is that it's unexpected. Or rather, the climate crisis itself may not be unexpected any more than the laws of physics are surprising. But the shape of the crisis, its flavor, its manifestation is. Or sometimes we, and I'm using we advisedly here and throughout this talk, just pretend to be surprised because it's easier. We're actually quite good at fooling ourselves. Perhaps our capacity for willful surprise and for the willful ignorance upon which it depends is surpassed only by our capacity to change the planet. Or, in the words of Arundhati Roy, once you get used to not seeing something, then slowly, it's no longer possible to see it. But this is heartbreaking stuff. Seriously, it's heartbreaking stuff. And I promise to talk about hopeful futures. And so going back to Lear, he considers the possibility that Plenty-Coups' narrative was an act of bearing witness to an end. And I would argue also that it's an accusation. We need to bear witness to the climate crisis, to come to grips with the despair, frustration, hopelessness, guilt, and grief associated with living through it and preventing the worst of it. This isn't throwing our hands up in some sort of climate fatalism, but we do need to look at the problem squarely in its eyes. We're facing a profound change to our world. And so Lear asks, the question is, what would it be for Plenty-Coups to bear witness to a peculiar form of human vulnerability? If there's a genuine possibility of happenings breaking down, it is one in which we all live. We might then consider what it means for us to witness what seems like an end, and what we might salvage. How might we use those things that we have recovered to make our own unexpected nonlinear leap? We're just going to watch this because we need it. So what does parkour have to do with the climate crisis? I know you're asking. They represent change, nonlinear, unequal, and unexpected. Thanks. We're still watching it, sweet. So they represent change, nonlinear, unequal, and unexpected, like the climate crisis itself. Which brings me back to Lear's book. Lear writes that the creation of a new world, a world in which something happens, would require a new poet. He writes, "Here I mean a poet in the broadest sense of a creative maker of meaningful space. Traceurs, traceuses are these playful poets." And so play is a tool for building something new. It's about repurposing the world as it is into one that is more robust, just, and vivacious. Creating a hopeful future will certainly take new policies, new technologies, new economic systems, and we'll need to get all of those just right, and we'll need to get them all just right fast. But I ask myself, my family asks me, my friends ask me, my students ask me, what can we do? They don't write policy. Sure, you can organize or vote, but those officials seem so distant and out of touch. What can we do today, tomorrow? Part of my answer today is to play. But that's just one tool. I mean to say that we can use the tools at our disposal to make something. We might also consider fostering and salvaging tools like craft, like recovery, like recognition, grief, linguistics, fear, patience, anger, refuge, care, memory, the commons, kinship, curiosity. This certainly isn't an exhaustive list, but for me, it represents the beginning of a toolbox with which we might build a path through a diminished world, through which we might make the world anew with more justice, more life, and more care. These tools aren't substitutions for justice-oriented decarbonizing policies, but a means to achieve them. James Scott reminds us that most revolutions are not the work of revolutionary parties, but the precipitate of spontaneous and improvised action. That the great emancipatory gains for human freedom have not been the result of orderly institutional procedures, but of disorderly, unpredictable, spontaneous action, cracking open the social order from below. The tools I've listed and others have already started widening that crack, and we can pry it open further. And the results of opening it will be different in different places. They'll be nonlinear, and they'll be unexpected, like the climate crisis itself. So for me, in order to live in a hopeful future, to leap into a future that's not merely survivable, but just and vibrant, to glide into a world in which things happen, we need to build it by salvaging our tools. We need to make things. We need to make things happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Brent, for that unexpected perspective. Last but not least, we have the organizer of this whole shindig. John Watkins started teaching economics at Westminster as an adjunct in 1981. His research interests lie in understanding corporate power, particularly as it applies to the evolution of consumer capitalism. His purpose in teaching is to raise the student's level of confusion, a goal towards which he continues to aspire with moderate success. A warm welcome for John Watkins.
Well, thank you very much. We have seen the enemy, and the enemy is us. Our addiction to fossil fuels, our culture of mindless consumption, our commitment to growth at any price. At the end of World War II, only half the households in the country had automobiles, virtually no one had a television set, and the interstate system had yet to be built. Today, most households have 2 or more cars, 97% of them have television sets, and the interstate, once touted as a solution to our transportation woes, seems woefully inadequate. As Americans, we like growth, but growth is an anomaly in the time span of the human species, and the age of growth may well be followed by the age of decline. The trends are ominous. Scientists have established a causal relationship between carbon dioxide levels and rising temperatures. There is a third more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than at any time in the past 800,000 years. Half of the carbon dioxide emitted by burning fossil fuels has been emitted in the past 30 years. 85% has been emitted since World War II. We have emitted 765 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere since the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. The Earth is a half-degree centigrade warmer than in the 1990s. The Arctic has warmed more than 3 degrees centigrade. In the past, when carbon dioxide matched current levels, forests grew in Antarctica and the seas were 60 feet higher. From an economic point of view, climate change is an economic bad. The harm it does to me does not reduce the harm to you. From an individual point of view, efforts to mitigate climate change appear inconsequential. Multiplied by 100 million, or even a billionfold, our efforts have consequences. To address this issue, however, will take a collective effort. We make our history, but we make it based on conditions inherited from the past. Our technology, our system of laws, our manner of living are handed to us from past generations. The dead hand of the past has reached out from the grave to determine the path we are on, and that path is unsustainable. The path is premised that maximizing profits benefits everyone. In pursuit of profit, we burn fossil fuels to make more stuff, to sell to more people, using the earned profits to burn more fuels, clear more forests, make more stuff. We have become like God, recreating the world in our image. To paraphrase Joni Mitchell, we paved paradise to set up a parking lot. All made possible from the processed remains of dead organisms living millions of years ago, all resting on the assumption that we can do what we damn well please. We realize now that there are unintended consequences to Adam Smith's invisible hand. Each individual pursuing his or her self-interest does not necessarily promote the interest of all. The invisible hand needs visible guidance. I am dismayed by those who deny that human activity causes climate change, most of whom seem to be in leadership positions. Their dream of untold profits has impaired their intellect, diminished their powers of observation, and debased their ethics. Anyone who has opened a car door on a sunny day has experienced the greenhouse effect. The empirical data covering thousands of years is conclusive. The Earth is warming. The naysayers present themselves as rational, generally conservative people. They are anything but. They are reckless, akin to hoodlums driving 100 miles per hour down the highway, inebriated, seatbelts unfastened, no insurance, all the while talking on their cell phones, complaining about regulations that impede their freedom. A rational person would slow down, sober up, set aside his cell phone, and buy insurance. And while the climate change is far more serious, the metaphor informs us to take precautions, prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Perhaps the naysayers can find solace in a quip by Groucho Marx. Why worry about posterity? What did posterity ever do for me? I will be blunt. We need to mitigate climate change, treating it as equivalent to this country's efforts to fight World War II. During World War II, government deficits approached 30% of gross domestic product. Government spending approached 45%, most going to the war effort. We spend whatever we need to mitigate climate change. We tax those activities and products that contribute to global warming. We need to place solar panels on every roof where the sun shines. We need to end global subsidies to the fossil fuel industry amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars a year. We need to tax carbon emissions. Renewables need to be subsidized. We need to reconsider nuclear power. Bill Gates has mobilized a team of engineers with a new design for nuclear energy, a design that uses nuclear waste for fuel and liquid metal as a coolant, resistance to meltdowns from tsunamis and earthquakes. We need to eat less beef. Less beef means less methane, which means less warming. We need to partner with business, requiring that they assume responsibility for their products from cradle to grave. We need to put our best minds not to develop financial derivatives and credit default swaps, which Warren Buffett referred to as financial instruments of mass destruction, but to develop innovations that will place us on a sustainable path. And we need to share our resources and technology with other nations. We can't do this alone, for we all breathe the same air. And those of us enjoying a Western lifestyle are primarily responsible for a warming planet. The poorest in the world are likely to suffer the most. We have an obligation to help them afford the changes that are necessary. And then there are the bitcoins, touted by libertarians as a way of avoiding government intrusion, an expression of their presumed God-given right to drive down the highway at 100 miles per hour. It is less known that making bitcoins has used more energy than all the energy generated by solar panels and wind, more than produced by the country of Ireland. So how do we pay for this? It's the same way we paid for the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, World War II. If we can spend $4 trillion to buy U.S. Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities enriching the rich, if we can spend $6 trillion fighting fruitless wars in the Middle East, surely we can spend that amount and more to slow and at some point, hopefully, reverse climate change. For those who respond it will be inflationary, I have two comments. First, a much greater threat of inflation will come from the millions of people moving here and elsewhere if the coastal cities flood and California continues to burn. And second, our real constraints are not financial. The real constraints are our willingness to commit our intellect, our resources, and our compassion to make the earth habitable for future generations. From a Darwinian point of view, it is a sad legacy if in the struggle for existence the human species won. For what have we won? An earth devoid of the diversity of life as we oversee the sixth great extinction. Are we to become like the Hindu god Shiva, the destroyer of worlds? Or will we use our collective wisdom to slow and eventually reverse climate change and, in the process, save ourselves? Thank you.
Well, that was awesome, and I'm sure it gave you a lot to think about in that beautiful interdisciplinary way that Westminster is so good at. So now we are gonna, if I could just have one of those maybe? Can I still one? Yeah, Great. Now we're going to have some time for a Q&A. So our panel's just going to sit here. I'll walk around with this microphone so you can ask a question. If you just want to ask it generally to the panel, you can do that, and you can also direct something to an individual. So does anyone have a question? Just want to raise your hand?
It's a basic question. Can I actually have all of you confirm your pronouns for me?
He, him, his. I apologize.
She or they?
She, her.
He, him, his.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Your pronouns?
My what?
Your pronouns?
Oh, pronoun. He.
He, him, his.
Thank you. Okay, what other questions do we have from the audience?
So this is directed to the entire panel. So like in these changing times on a global scale, it's important that we all as a world come to prevent climate change. However, it's also becoming very apparent that it is easier to rationalize eco-fascist ideals, such as the idea that poor nations can die off and that will be our solution. How will the world, through the UN or anything, help to stop the rationalization of these ideals, and how can richer countries help poorer countries actually compete?
That's the million-dollar question. I'm reminded of a Frederick Jameson quote, who he wrote that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And so I think one of the ways that I would propose we think about this is to use, maybe to tie it back to my talk, to use these tools that we can do every day to build new communities, to foster new sets of relationships that are teleconnected. I mentioned video games. I'm a terrible video game player. I'm not even going to pretend. But I read the story about Fortnite players. The goal of Fortnite is you go around, try to kill all. It's Hunger Games on a video game. But a bunch of them got together and they formulated this day where they were all going to land on the island and go to this part of the island. And rather than try to eliminate everybody, they were going to hang out and just knock down all the buildings and then throw a dance party. And they did it. Right? So they organized across all kinds of international boundaries and whatever other way this might work in order to make this little moment of community happen. And so I think when I talk about the tools that I propose, not necessarily being a policy that'll fix everything, but a means to that policy, I think about the ways that we might build super inventive and surprising communities that can then lead towards mobilization in ways that are just and equitable, which is a halfway to an answer, but it's a start.
That is an unbelievably complicated question. So I'll make an effort. I think developing new technologies and sharing that with them. And one of the interesting cases, and Han could certainly speak to this better than I could, but one of the major plagues in terms of the developing world is the issue of dysentery. So if we could apply our knowledge and our technology and develop innovation simply to make, and I understand Bill Gates has made an effort to do this, a toilet that doesn't use water, that is relatively inexpensive in an effort to help reduce dysentery and diseases and hopefully generate cleaner water. So I think there may be, we haven't made an effort to do this very much, but there are if we can send a space shuttle into orbit and go to the moon, you would think we could apply our technology and our knowledge and our engineers to develop these more humble innovations that could have a significant impact on people. And that would be my response. But there doesn't seem to be the will. One of the wonderful things I think about the youth right now is this sense of urgency and political action, and I cannot encourage that enough to demand change from our political leaders.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think everything is necessarily a tech fix either. I think that we can imagine global networks of mutual aid and acknowledge the agency and self-determination of these nations that are going to be really impacted in this crisis. And so, yeah, trying to figure out where do we have resources, and what are the resources that are needed in some of these countries that are currently being hit by huge climate disaster. And then I would also say, like, we need to end patterns of Western imperialism. We need to question the neoliberal systems that we live in. For those who have not heard of neoliberalism, it's essentially global capitalism, which has taken over our political systems. So yeah, as young people, we have immense power to resist and question the current systems that we live in, including the ways that we interact on global scales, and really start to build solidarity networks, because we have everything that we need. We have enough on this planet for everyone to live a beautiful life. So, yeah.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? Great.
Hello. Oh, wow, that's all right. First off, I want to thank you guys all for being here and spending time to educate us and to breathe light into a very, very important topic, and to get us excited about things that we can do in our communities, and how we can have these discussions. My question is with regards to the Paris Climate Accords. I was just curious what your thoughts were on those, how you feel that on a worldwide basis, whether the implementations that are currently on the Paris Climate Accords and with the plans that go with that, do you feel like that's enough? Do you feel like there's more? Do you feel like, I know we're not soliciting that right now, but and so just thoughts on the Paris Climate Accords, and sort of, do you think that that's a good step forward, or do you think there's more we could do? Yeah.
I'll give you the standard line, and then I'll give you my line, if that's fair. One thing we know about the Paris Climate Accords is even if every nation meets its targets, we still go past 1.5 degrees. So the crux of it is, no, not enough. And 1.5 degrees is the number that, still a relatively arbitrary number, and it's important to note that it's not like we hit 1.5 and then it's a cliff, like it's a like weird stair-stepped process of getting worse. But the Paris Climate Accords, even if they're met, don't achieve that target. And so then the question becomes, having said that, I will say some motion is better than no motion, right? I'd rather have the Paris Climate Accords in place than not have the Paris Climate Accords in place. The question is how do we think about those accords beyond just what nations are accomplishing? And I think one of the interesting movements in the United States in the last, well, and actually globally, not just the United States, has been the way that local municipalities, counties, states, organizations like Eliza's have stepped up to find creative ways to fill those gaps. So when there's not leadership at the national level, cities and municipalities and regions are doing really interesting things to make some things happen on scales that they can't. And so there's tremendous power in doing that. Everything from Paris's new law that says all new construction either has to have solar panels or green roofs, right? So like that's something that the city of Paris can do to make a change at that level. There are some things that need to be done at national levels. A national global carbon, or a national carbon tax, like that's a national policy. A global carbon market is another kind of policy. At the end of the day, though, those, I would argue, are continuing along this neoliberal tradition of pricing natural resources, which can be problematic and dangerous. So I think that a piece of this is structuring new relationships for how we live and govern, and that doesn't necessarily need to be through market-oriented solutions.
It's interesting if you look at the data, because Europe has actually reduced its carbon emissions, and it's reduced them rather significantly. And Germany was particularly in the front in terms of windmill technology and solar power and so forth, and the cost of that technology has fallen considerably. The worst CO2 polluter country-wise, of course, is China. Per capita, we Americans are still way out in front. But if I go back to World War II, this country did unbelievable things. I mean, this whole country was mobilized. And that's, I think, what it would take. And the great thing about at least fighting climate change, we're not building bombs to kill people. You're building infrastructures and developing technologies that can actually improve lives. And I think this country, it has enormous resources and enormous talent. We just haven't had the leadership to lead. And hopefully if the followers, if there's a movement enough to actually demand leadership, the leaders perhaps will follow.
Great. I'm happy to take the next question. Just gonna go back here.
Hi. So I'm from a third world country in West Africa, and hearing all this is kind of concerning. And my question is, what are some stuff that countries like mine, knowing that we don't have much resources, can do to make the impact of global warming less on us?
So this is a tough one. I've traveled quite a bit through Africa, Asia, and one of the frustrations with me is that we tend to demonize places like China and developing countries, India, China, newly developing countries who are trying to build up their economies, where in fact they are just trying to get to where we're at. They would love, I've never met anyone who doesn't want the American lifestyle. So this is kind of a frustrating question for me from a justice standpoint because, I mean, why should we, I mean, we basically grew our lifestyle on the backs of everything, exactly, all the resources, and we're at the top, and now we're expecting everyone else in the world to sacrifice for our sins. And so I guess, I think it's a really good question. I think this has to be a global effort, but at the same time, if we're gonna, look at it from a justice perspective, we have the biggest responsibility. We really do. The U.S., the Western world, the developed world, the ones that colonize the rest of the world, the ones that, basically have our 3,000 square foot homes and 2.5 cars and however many dogs, whatever, on the backs of the developing world. It's really our responsibility.
Another thing that I think developing countries have the opportunity for is to skip all of the crap all of the developed nations have gone through. You skip all of the burning of fossil fuels. You go straight to renewable energy sources. You go straight to solar infrastructure in unconnected parts of the world where you install solar panels and you create opportunity. And with the help of developed nations of the world, you just skip all of that and you bring these countries up to a much higher, healthier standard of living than what, in some respects, we are living right now.
You are raising such an incredible point, and I think that you're also finding a career for yourself. Because this is exactly the kind of ambassador that your country needs to bring back the truth about, the good and bad of the American lifestyle and the good paths and the not so good paths. I love your question, and I think that, we have comments, but we don't really have an answer, a direct answer. But what a great question. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
All right. So one thing that kind of has been in the back of my head during like this whole climate discussion, and just so you know, I hope like this isn't a bad faith question, because so much of this discussion is truly like bad faith, and this is an actual genuine question I have. So when people talk about like solar panels, wind turbines, all of that, those all require, you know, natural resources like cobalt and lithium. But most of those resources are mined in places like the Congo, where working conditions are like, you know, everyone knows, really bad. So how do we go about, I mean, and like y'all said, 2030 is like the year that everything is gonna like, you know, take a real downward dive, you know.
I'm going back to Brent's video because that gave me a lot of hope.
Yeah. So like, how do we, I don't know, get these resources without making other problems worse?
I want to address the 2030 thing really quickly, and then I want to hand this over to Eliza and just transition. So 2030, what he's talking about is the UN has sort of said that we need to reduce CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030 in order to have a chance of avoiding this 1.5 degree limit, not limit, target, that beyond which things get worse. I do, once again, just want to caution about thinking about that as a cliff, in the sense that like, well, because here's what happens if you start thinking about that as a cliff. Like, if you're driving a car and you know you're going to drive off the cliff, if it's me, I'm going to floor it so I'm going as fast as I can while I go off the cliff, so I have much fun on the fall as I possibly can. Right? So if we think about that as a cliff, that's the danger. If we think about it as like, we need to hit this target in order to maintain, in order to start to avoid some of the worst, but if we keep emitting after that point, it keeps getting worse. So it's not like if we miss that target, it's game over. It's just if we miss that target, the game just gets harder and harder and harder and harder. So that's just a clarification that I think is worth making. So if the question is, we know that our means of production of energy today are terrible and are causing this problem, but it also looks like perhaps our other options for producing energy are also terrible. So what are we going to do, right? Is that sort of the crux of the question? Yeah. And so I would love to hear your comments on how we think about extraction of some of those chemicals that are important to alternative means of energy generation. And then so that's, I guess, where I was leading you. And I would just say, here's what I'll say, as quick as I can. I don't know the I don't know the language of wow. We tend to discount sunk investments. So what that means is we tend to discount all the work that we've done to create a fossil fuel dependent economy. We tend to discount the existing costs of maintaining that fossil fuel dominant economy and say everything new is hard. I would argue that maintaining what we have is even harder, but those are costs that we're blind to.
I guess what I'll say on this question also is that this is a time of imagination for all of us, especially for young people. This is a time of claiming our power. I think something that I try to think about every day and that I would like all of you to think about is that we are the leaders right now. We're not waiting for a leader who's going to come and save us, right? Like, we have to rise every morning to this crisis, and we have to be thinking of these alternatives. This is something I think about a lot, like what goes in a solar panel, like where are these resources coming from? I think you're raising a really important question. And yeah, we have to come together and come up with economic systems, energy systems, entire systems of being that are things that we've never experienced before, which is both terrifying and really, really exciting because we have so much potential and opportunity. And And I think something that I also wanted to respond to on thinking about the Paris Accords and sort of this notion of urgency is that we could shut down all of the power plants, everything today, and we would still be living through a climate crisis in our futures. And so I think we have to be thinking about how we're going to produce energy in the future, how we're going to reduce our emissions, but we also have to be thinking about how we are building communities that are going to support each other and what we're doing on the ground in our interpersonal relationships, how we're caring for each other, because we have, regardless, no matter what we do, we are going to be living through something. And so we have to come together.
Thank you.
Well, on that lovely thought, thank you all for being here tonight, and I'm sure our panelists will be happy to stick around if you have any last questions. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday evening.